Hello everyone and welcome to Nibble Pop. If you have Milton's Paradise Lost in your syllabus this semester, you are already very puzzled about the whole thing and pretty frightened too, I guess. But let me assure you that Paradise Lost is going to be either the most horrible or the most beautiful experience that your syllabus is going to offer you. My job is to make it at least approachable for you, and maybe you will begin to look at the text in a different way than usually we approach it. After you watch this introductory session, I will ask you to go and watch all the videos that we have uploaded in this series, so that by the end of it you will feel very confident about the whole text, because here not only you will get an in-depth analysis of the lines in the poem, or rather the first book of this epic, but also different ways of looking at things. Please subscribe to our channel to stay connected. This is Monami Mukherjee. Welcome once again. Paradise Lost is a kind of a definition in itself, and possibly all that you have read up to now and will be reading in the rest of your course will be similar to this one. You will have complex poems, you will have complicated stories, but you hardly have a book which is both so grand in scale and so deep in its literary merit. And I don't know how much justice can be done by teaching it on YouTube videos or through any online medium, and even in classrooms. When I take this text up, I always feel that, am I doing justice to it? Am I actually making people understand what I want them to? With other texts in the syllabus, I feel that fine, I'll manage this, but I always feel like nobody is good enough to teach this. It's like a religious adoration I have for this text maybe, but it's going to be a way I'm going to communicate to you how my wonderful teacher in my college, it was Professor Indrani Chaudhuri Datto in Lady Bribon College, how she managed to make us feel in tune with the text. I don't know how much I can offer you what she offered us, but it will be a humble, you can say, enterprise on my part. And in this introductory video, I'm going to just make you understand what it's all about and what to expect from it, and the kind of mental preparation Milton would have expected his readers to have. And we are more than readers, right? We are actually looking at the text because we have to sit for an exam. Therefore, our attention should be more focused and demands more time. So that's why we need this introductory session. Now, to understand this book, you have to understand three things. If you know about these three things, which I'm going to mention to you, then you'll be able to, crack Paradise Lost, I can say. If you leave out any one of these, it will be very difficult for you then. So what are these three things? First, the age in which Milton wrote, the Puritan age, the Restoration and the history behind it. Second, the story of the Bible, at least of the Genesis, the first part of the Bible, the Old Testament. And not just about Adam and Eve, but the stories involving Noah, Moses, the Exodus. So the episodes in the Bible which keep on repeating themselves in the book of Paradise Lost. And that is why I would suggest that go for any standard book, even children's books, which give you the basic storyline or the main episodes of the Bible, so that when you come across any character's name which appears in the Bible in Paradise Lost, you suddenly can associate with the biblical backdrop or the framework against which Milton was working. You can even go for these online PDFs and even videos But it is always better to read than watch, because when you will read Paradise Lost, things that you have read will be better remembered in context of the book that you are reading. There are different movies made on different episodes of the Genesis. You have stories or movies on Noah and then Moses, and then this beautiful movie, The Ten Commandments, a movie which I always make sure my students at college they watch. So if you can, go and watch that movie, The Ten Commandments. And then the third thing which you must know about is Milton's life, the way he was brought up, what kind of things he did, and what kind of literature he was acquainted with. Now, if you have at least a basic understanding of these three things, only then you can really begin to understand how Milton's poetry is intimately connected with his life, is intimately connected with the history in which he lived, or rather the historical age in which he lived, and the story of the Bible. So understanding Paradise Lost is not just understanding the lines that he wrote and their literal meanings, that is part of it. But when will you realize that I have understood what Paradise Lost is about, is the point where you can finally connect these three things: the historical backdrop, Milton's life, and the story of the Bible. When you can finally establish a connection between the three through the text, then you can say that, okay, I have at least tried to or started to understand what Milton was saying. All right. So let me just give you a basic outline of the Puritan age. Now, if you have already watched the videos on Puritan age, Age of Milton, Restoration, which are available in the series on history of literature, that might be useful. You can always go back and watch it later. But let me just give you a basic overview here. Let's not just, talk a lot about dates and events, rather talk about things like a story. What happened during the Puritan age? Why is it called the Puritan age? When did this age start? So Puritan age is the time when Milton lived. Now, while doing Shakespeare, like you are familiar with the age in which Shakespeare lived, because I assume that now that you are in semester 3, you have had semester 2, and there you have had Shakespeare's sonnet perhaps, or maybe his plays. So somehow you are acquainted with the kind of world that the Renaissance represents, or England during the Renaissance represents. Okay, so it was a world which was more in tune with human liberty, freedom of the mind, of expression, and reviving the classical ethos of literary creation. That is why it's called Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth. Now, although the Renaissance started again much before the reign of Queen Elizabeth, but it is believed that during the time of Queen Elizabeth, England reached the highest glory, or you can say it was the highest point of Renaissance. Now, this Renaissance, which again started in Europe, not just in England, it started in Italy. It was kind of giving human beings this awareness that God is not at the center of the universe. Earlier, during the Middle Ages, people used to have this idea that God is the center of the universe, the focus of your life. Whatever you do in life is centered around how God will judge you. But Renaissance represents a time when you begin to look at man as a center of possibilities. Man is responsible for the things that happen to him because he exercises his choice consciously. It's not fate which controls you, but rather your own actions. And that idea is developed in plays written by Shakespeare, by Marlowe. And what we have here is called a homocentric worldview. So homocentric means man at the center. Earlier it was theocentric. Theo is God and centric is at the center. So the shift from theocentric to homocentric worldview, that is the basic quality of the Renaissance. That's why it's also called, humanism. It's about human beings as agents of action. Now, this was a natural consequence of many things, result of many things. You see, it was a time of scientific revolution on one hand. Then we have this proliferation of knowledge, scattering of knowledge because of the printing press, because of which different kinds of scriptures or religious texts which were not earlier available to common people were now being made available through translations. So people could actually read what was in the Bible and not depend on these priests to interpret them for them. So naturally, people started to have their own ideas about religion, and not just religion, about morality, about social responsibility, about man's position in the universe, and also have that courage to question them. Again, what we have is a lot of explorations were going around. People were going out of their comfort zones to explore new places in the world. And when you explore new places, you not just have a geographical expansion, but you have a cultural expansion. So people of Europe were now coming in contact with these Oriental cultures, again this American culture, although that American culture is so different from what we now know as American culture. It was more like native culture of America. But this variety of experience was something that helped in the blooming and blossoming of Renaissance, not just in Europe, but in England in general. So this did not affect just literature, but we see this reflected in art, music, sculpture, and different other ways of expression. So Renaissance is, as I've already told you, it's a time when the mind is liberated, freed from its darkness, from its superstitious, conservative self. So that is what Renaissance represents for us. During Elizabeth's time, why is it considered the most glorious period so far as Renaissance England is concerned? Elizabeth was a very capable ruler, and she understood that in order to rule in a perfect way, one has to have a harmony between the church, the state, and the voice of the people. And she could maintain this balance. Now, since there was already a rising preference for a different kind of Christianity, a Christianity which challenged these rituals and hierarchies of Catholicism, a different kind of Christianity was evolving, and Elizabeth managed to somehow not let the conflict between two kinds of Christians become an issue during her time. And she understood that the relationship between the king and the church, or the queen and the church, should be a stable one, should be a healthy one, and not set against each other. And religion was a very defining factor in those days in Europe. Maybe it's not so anymore, but it is still relevant in many countries, and often many countries and nations are really controlled by the religious forces, or rather the kind of government who bank on people's religious sentiments. Okay, that's again a disputable thing, and let's just come back to our topic here. So religion was very relevant during the times, because although Renaissance kind of freed people's minds, but still, you don't let go of a habit of thousands of years. So people were kind of conflicted at times, whether they were doing the right thing freeing themselves from the clutches of religion or not. And this is how religion started to get changed, transformed. It started to evolve. And when something happens like an evolution in religion, then it cracks into two parts, and that happened with Christianity. So there were these prominent different kinds of Christianity that were present. One, the Catholic or the original believers in age-old rituals and practices, and Puritanism, where people believe that man has direct access to God. There should not be any intermediary thing. If you are pure at heart and you follow the scriptures, then that is what your job is. Unlike the Catholics who believe that you have to actually listen to the Pope and the Bishop and the Archbishop because they know best, they are your mediators with God. And this led to dividing the whole nation into two halves. And now let me talk about the person who came to the throne of England after Elizabeth. His name was James, and it's after him that the age is called the Jacobean age, because Jacobus is the other name for James. So what happened when James came to the throne of England? Now, when James came to power, he passed this decree according to which he didn't have to answer for any of his actions to the church, and that kind of provided him with an immunity. Okay, he was being protected by his own order, by his own decree, that the church cannot question any decision that he takes as a king. Now the problem is, when a ruler gets this kind of immunity, this guarantee that nobody is going to question you, then all right, you get free to do good for your people, but at the same time you also get this freedom to become a tyrant about what taxations you are imposing, what rules you are imposing on people, because you don't have to answer to anybody. So James created this platform of governance where he doesn't have to think about other people's opinion. This was happily taken up by his successor, Charles I. Now, Charles I was a lazy guy. Many people accuse him of cruelty and tyranny and malicious behavior, but basically he was a lazy man, undiplomatic, political failure. He never realized that a little bit of compromise could have saved him from being completely destroyed at the end. Now, what he started to do was he got himself into a battle with everybody. Now, by the time Charles was in power, there was this body called the Parliament, which was not as powerful, of course, as today, but it was a kind of a buffer between the people and the ruler. It was like the voice of the state. And Charles, he completely disregarded everything that the Parliament had to tell him, because he believed in the divine right of kings, that the king is the representative of God on earth, and therefore nobody can question him, nobody can put him on trial, because he is chosen by God to rule people. So that's his divine right. So if you are fighting everybody, then no amount of immunity can guarantee that you will survive, let alone be victorious. Now, the Parliament was mostly filled with people who believed in the Puritan ethos. So it was like not just a battle between the king and the Parliament, but a battle between two sets of beliefs. Now, why did the Puritan trend get so important during this time? Why not during Elizabeth's time? One reason could have been that during the time of Elizabeth, because it was the time of the High Renaissance. You have these great playwrights writing, these great poets writing, and England was comparatively, a center of much merrymaking. People enjoyed their lives. You are so engaged in entertaining yourself, so engaged in exploring these new models of literature, art, fashion, then you tend to ignore the moral aspects of life. You kind of begin to overlook the scriptures a bit. And a Puritan person is somebody who sticks to the rules, who is purely devoted to the word of God. So that is the difference between a Catholic person and a Puritan person on a basic level. So it's a fight between two kinds of people who believe in the same God, in the same Christ, but their paths are different. You see, when I talk about this homocentric worldview, it also is a selfish worldview. You place yourself at the center of everything. And it is this selfishness that makes you not see things in a moral light. And when do you have these moral concerns? When you look at society and you see some injustices done, when you are capable of thinking outside yourself, that is like thinking about it as a moral being. So while the whole of Europe is revived by this Renaissance, a different kind of Renaissance was taking place in England at the end of it, and that was this moral Renaissance, reawakening of the moral self. So what we can feel that here, Puritanism represents a rejection of excess of life. When whatever is extra, excess, they want to trim it. And it went on so far that they thought that drama, performance, all these things were deviating man from his moral path of life, and they trimmed those and they ended up closing the theatres. I've given you a very detailed idea about this whole thing in the videos on the Puritan age, where you will see that the events which led to the closing of the theatres, those were because of the way in which the Puritans looked at drama, that it is something which is deviating man from the moral course of life. Now, coming back to Charles, as we were saying that he started to have this conflict with the Parliament. Each and every directive or advice or suggestion that the Parliament gave him, he completely disregarded them, cut them off, and eventually, because people of England, they were also getting sick and tired of different kinds of ill-advised taxes imposed on them, different tyrannical measures that Charles was taking because he wanted to win certain fights with certain countries. There was this complete disgust that people felt for Charles, and therefore when eventually people of England noticed that there was a prominent leader, a Puritan person called Oliver Cromwell, he was gathering forces, people supported him. And then one fine day, Charles lost everything, including his head. He was beheaded, a Puritan government was set up, established. There was no concept of any king, but you can say the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, came to rule England. And this was the time when the theatres were closed and people were kind of encouraged to follow the Puritan principles. By encouraged, I mean that Catholic people were persecuted, threatened. So a different kind of tyranny was somehow happening. And this happens, when any rule changes, a different political party comes to power, then the supporters of the previous ruler, they get persecuted. This is a natural thing that happens. They were sick and tired of monarchy and they said that we don't need a king now. And this was considered to be a very democratic thing. People were rather happy that we are no more, under the rule of a monarch, but we are ruling ourselves. The parliament is ruling us. So they were thinking that they were recreating the idea of the Roman Republic with the all-powerful Senate and no king at all. Then what went wrong? When Oliver Cromwell, he died a natural death, although he was in a lot of stress, and probably that kind of hastened the process, but he died a natural death. And in a democracy, what should have happened after Cromwell died? People should have again decided upon an electoral process in which they could elect the next person who is going to govern them. But instead of that, Oliver Cromwell's son, Richard Cromwell, he was chosen as the Lord Protector. Now people of England started to think that, okay, earlier we had this king whose son became the king, and that was the problem, because it's like the rulers are always chosen by birth. Here also the same thing is happening. So what is the difference here? And people of England have this preference for this blue blood, and they say that if the king's son becomes the king, let's have a proper blue-blooded king's son. And another thing that was happening is that, you see, during the rule of Oliver Cromwell, because it was a Puritan regime, there was a massive imposition of Puritan ideas in everyday life, including fashion. You didn't have any modes of entertainment such as theatre. So if you are deprived of things for a long time, then you begin to revolt against it. Now people started to feel that we are safe, we are strong, we are protected, fine. But where's the fun? And it's natural human instinct to choose fun over security. So what did the people do? They got rid of this new Lord Protector. Who was going to be the king now? Charles II, the son of Charles I, who had fled to France during the beheading of his father. He was brought back and put on the throne of England, and monarchy was restored, which means brought back. This happened in 1660, and that is why that year or that date is referred to as the restoration of England's monarchy. And the period after 1660 is known as the Restoration Age. Now what happened after Charles II was brought back as a king? You see, for this entire Puritan regime, or this entire period that the Puritan rule was set in England, there was a large-scale repression of all kinds of desires. The people didn't go to parties, they didn't have late nights, they didn't go to theatres, so there were no masks, no happy parades. So people were repressed. And when you keep people repressed for long under a suppressive rule, and then they get this freedom, they erupt. And the whole thing kind of backfires even. So when you choke people with morality, they will completely blow everything away when they can manage and escape. So people started to disregard every rule of morality, because when something extreme happens, then the reaction is also equally extreme. Because this Puritan rule was so extreme, therefore the rejection of this Puritan rule was also equally devastating for the general morality of the country. And this was also because Charles II, as a person, he was quite colorful too. We don't call him a tyrant, we don't do that. But he was definitely not a person with very high moral standards himself. He didn't have a child of his own, and he, not a legitimate son. And he went on having these children with women outside his wedlock. So that was a kind of ideal that he was providing. You look up to your king as a model. So when your king is doing all these things, that becomes the accepted code of behavior. And the kind of literature that was being produced during this time, they reflect what was happening in the society. So if you look at the Restoration comedies, like the Comedy of Manners, and the mock epics of the times, or the verse satires of the times, you would notice the kind of lifestyle that the people who belong to the high and the middle class society, they were used to. And it was completely against the codes of the previous government. Now, when Charles became the King of England, Charles II, what he did was, he wanted to become a good king by not actually actively persecuting all supporters of Cromwell, but since the people who were now in government, who were supporting Charles II, those were people who were Catholic minded, they wanted revenge, and warrants were issued against at least the prominent people who supported Oliver Cromwell and his son. And many of these high-ranking supporters of Oliver Cromwell, they had to go into hiding for years. And one of the most prominent people who had to literally hide from the whole world during this time was John Milton. Why did he have to do that? Why was he in this position? We will know about this whole history of Milton's connection with this whole Puritan regime, and why this is connected to Paradise Lost eventually in our next video. So stay tuned, don't go anywhere, stay subscribed, and in the meantime, go and watch that video on Puritan age and the Restoration age as a revision. Thank you all for being here. I hope you will enjoy the classes on Paradise Lost. Thank you once again. Bye-bye.